Oh, and just a super quick note for especially the closing teams, you're very close to us, so we can hear you, so be very quiet when you're talking with your partner, okay? Just keep that in mind. Otherwise, I would like to welcome the Prime Minister to give a speech not to exceed 7 minutes, and the motion that stands in their name. Hear, hear.
Hear, hear.
If China had a military base 5 miles off the coast of the District of Columbia, we think that it'd be a pretty tense place, and we think that we as Americans would be really tense about this. We think that China is a rational actor, and we are going to radically de-escalate and limit troop presence on Taiwan, limiting military support in this. So, model of course in a couple parts. First, what we're taking away. We think that this is taking away military support directly. We think that this is reducing the amount of troops that we have in there, and in particular, the amount of warships that we have in the Strait. We're going to be reducing it, we're not going to be removing it, but we're going to be reducing it to a purely ceremonial group levels, right, that we look like. This looks like 100 U.S. infantrymen there, right? That this isn't a functional military base. This is merely to deter invasion and to imminently bring the U.S. into invasion if anything were to happen to Taiwan, right? But this looks like de-escalating this and making this a much less functional place. This is going to be a progressive de-escalation, that we're going to be doing this over years, and we hope to be doing this, and we're going to be using this as part of a negotiation strategy with China. We're going to be quid pro quo de-escalating it with Chinese support to North Korea. For that clarification.
Taiwan currently sits under the U.S. nuclear umbrella. Would you continue that?
No, we would not. That fundamentally what we're going to be doing is we're going to be leaving a mere token presence in Taiwan because we think that this will fundamentally de-escalate one of the single most dangerous flashpoints in the entire world. So let's talk about who this conflict is important to. Two actors in this, the U.S. and China, right? So let's talk about what Taiwan is to China. So China has the One China policy where they believe that they should have the restoration of their historical borders. China was the refuge of the nationalist government that was driven out by the People's Republic of China. And there is some tension, and China at the very least wants it to return to its sphere of influence. We don't think this looks like military subjugation, or complete destruction of the culture there, look like Hong Kong, but China wants de jure to be the power in its region, as most regional powers are wont to do, right? That we think that by and large, China wants to be a regional hegemon, and it doesn't want other hegemons to have any threats on the border. Let's look historically at this, right? The reason why we had the nuclear crisis in Cuba is because we placed nuclear missile batteries in Turkey within striking distance of St. Petersburg. So they reacted in kind, and then the U.S. was incredibly surprised. There's nukes that could hit Florida and the East Coast. This is threatening to us existentially. We fundamentally believe, and what happened is that after the Cuban Missile Crisis was resolved, we very quietly took all our missiles out of Turkey and pretended that we never put them there in the first place. This is precisely what we want to do in this event, right? So let's talk about what the U.S. wants to do. We think that the U.S. wants two things, right? The U.S. wants to try to be able to check Chinese aggression, and this is the reason why that they've used this idiot ham-fisted policy that hasn't worked for so long. We also think the U.S. wants to secure long-term peace and economics in the region, fundamentally, right? That we think that we failed to check China because China is primarily an economic rival and a threat rather than a military threat, and we think that by and large all this has made China defensive. This is how states fundamentally act. So, two additional points: why the Taiwan Strait is such an important flashpoint, and second, why China will how we can use this to get negotiations with North Korea. So here's why this motion exists. Because last week, a Chinese warship was 45 yards away from a U.S. warship. This is a fairly common thing in incredibly tense situations where what they're trying to do is they're trying to spook each other off. Neither one wants to look weak. This is an incredibly terrifying thing. That we also see that China surrounding the island with warships in a greater degree. And we don't think that China wants to take over the island. China needs to project strength directly, but we think that this projection of strength is incredibly risky. All we need is a single rogue officer on any of these vessels, right? All we need is a single misfired shot A single bad communications, the false register of any sort of missile activity, and we think that they respond in kind, and this escalates into a war with China. We think that this risk is terrifying, right? We look at in the Cold War that when we launched a satellite without notifying the Russians, we almost had a full-on nuclear war had the Russian Missile Command not double-checked it. We almost saw the death of every life on Earth, and we think that the present fight between the two great hegemons would be terrifying and bad, right? That we are not going to risk this flashpoint, because this is an incredibly thin strait. It is incredibly rich with destroyers and battleships, and each one of these presents another chance of us rolling the dice for the lives of every man, woman, and child on Earth. So, fundamentally, we are not going to do this. So, let's talk about why we think China, after us not doing this, isn't going to go, oh, we're going to take over. They're going to de-escalate, because this is how things happen. In a quid pro quo gesture, we reduce this threat to China, and they reduce this threat to us. And we reduce this threat to China, that by and large they need to project strong borders, right? But they have no specific interest in militarily occupying Taiwan, right? It is incredibly damaging them internationally, it hurts them economically, invites economic reprisals, and they don't gain anything more than they do in the system. But they do have to project strength on the global stage. So, we think that we did, in the South China Sea, right, last May, we removed warships, and China said we'll remove warships as well, and there is lower Chinese warship presence in the South China Sea, right? Before this closing.
Okay, the thing is, China does have an interest in Taiwan because a lot of their foreign policy is based off the idea of saving face. Right? Potentially occupying Tibet doesn't give them any benefits, but they do it anyways because they think it's theirs. They feel the same about Taiwan.
They invade Tibet because it's within its regional economic sphere. China is not an irrational actor. We have to treat them with the exact same level of respect. We treat U.S. foreign policy, which is to say it is driven by interest and it is primarily rational. So let's talk about what the U.S. gets out of this, which is greater negotiations with North Korea. So China fundamentally props up North Korea in three ways. They prop them up economically, militarily, and politically. Economically, North Korea is a failed state that can't feed its own people. China helps subsidize them. Militarily, China does not have the fuel. North Korea does not have the fuel reserves to mount an offensive. China provides that. They are not sanctioned by the UN Security Council because China is a member of this council, right? So China has historically said in their One China policy that for the past 45 years they want either a concession from the U.S. on the Korean Peninsula or on the in these Taiwanese straits. Right? We are willing to trade one for the other. That the reason why China is so nervous about it is because they think that the U.S. is trying to mount military resources for a hypothetical invasion, that they could win, that they could have air bases, that they have intel, that they have this. We literally think this happened. The Korean War, the reason why China got involved is once we were pushing into the northern regions, this presents an existential threat to China, and they want to see these existential threats removed. We've seen the failure of the Kim Jong of the recent summit. We don't think that we can ever make any progress on North Korea unless they lose the support of their primary benefactor, and we believe that mutually quid pro quo measures are the only thing that's going to bring them to the table. We are incredibly proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for their speech and welcome up the Leader of Opposition to open up the opposition.
Is that what you're looking
here.
David and I are going to lay out a couple of principled reasons why it's vitally important that we protect democracy in Taiwan. Next, we're going to, after that, tell you why, according to dual deterrence theory, it would be the absolute worst case scenario possible to withdraw military support. When do we intervene in the name of state legitimacy? We intervene to secure instances of state legitimacy when there is a threat to that democracy from an external source. In this case, pay attention that the Prime Minister said literally nothing about Taiwan, which is who we're supposed to be talking about in today's debate. Human rights are related to democracy because self-determination is a prerequisite to democracy. If you believe in democracy, as I know that our team from last night's round definitely do, we are going to vote in favor of opening opposition. All right. Let's talk a little bit about why the U.S. specifically is a good actor in the region for protecting democracy. Firstly, we're the biggest military hegemon. We understand that China has been increasing their military over the past few years. This shows that they're willing to escalate, but it does not show that they're at the same level willing to attack the U.S. Secondly, we can see that the U.S. doesn't have a super great history with like protecting democracy around the world. But we think that this is a unique scenario to pursue peace in the region. Thirdly, we think that the U.S. should intervene and does intervene in scenarios where human rights are being abused. I will demonstrate specifically why that's happening in both Taiwan and China writ large. Then, if we talk about moral culpability. If you believe that we can sit back as the U.S. and watch China impede on Taiwan in the same way that it did on Tibet and destroy all of their autonomy and human rights, we don't think that you are looking at the U.S. as a moral actor and something that we should do. Why China specifically is a bad actor? We agree with opening government's analysis that China wants to be a regional hegemon. I'm going to tell you specifically in my discussion about hegemony why it's better to have one global hegemon, specifically the U.S., and why regional hegemons empirically fail. Secondly, the one China policy that they're talking about is evil, and it's used to justify human rights violations like the slaughtering of ethnic minority groups. We see that this has already happened in China with the Uyghurs, which is which is a Muslim minority that exists within China. This is an active act of human rights abuses. This means this disproves all of opening government's really confusing analysis about why they're saving face, supposedly. We know that if they're already cared about saving face, then they wouldn't be continually abusing the Uyghur population. This is an instance to demonstrate that they're wrong. All right. Next, the examples coming out of opening government are absolutely ridiculous. Firstly, they say Hong Kong was totally fine. No, Hong Kong lost their ability to be an autonomous collective, lost their culture, and lost their ability to be self-determining. Secondly, they say that the Turkey, where this is going to be modeled like the Turkey missile crisis. The PM tells you specifically that was a secret that got found out. This means that the U.S. will not be able to do this well. All right. The main problem with the Prime Minister's case is there's a double bind. He says specifically that China's only in it for the economy and they're not a military aggressor, but then he says that China's rapidly expanding and is a military aggressor. He needs to choose one or the other and tell us no. Next, on the quid pro quo element, I don't think that they get any solvency to this argument. They're saying that Taiwan, or that China will de-escalate in Taiwan because the U.S. is taking the action first. While this may have worked in a small instance of the South China Sea, no, thank you. It's not going to happen, especially after the fact that the U.S. already looks weak because of our failed trade war with China. The fact that the U.S. looks weak means that China doesn't see the U.S. as a power that they can work with. They see that as a power that they can abuse. This is already true with North Korea. No, thank you. All right. What do we talk about when we're talking about Taiwan? We're talking about a people who have their own culture, who have their own autonomy, who have the ability and should have the ability to define what it means to be themselves. What's interesting about the U.S. specifically, and why the U.S. is a good actor, is our presence in Taiwan is not boots on the ground, is not, yes, it's boots on the ground, but it's not that we are going to be the ones who are specifically going to be fighting China off. Rather, the U.S. military presence in Taiwan gives the Taiwanese people the confidence to then attack China, or to then defend themselves against China on their own. We think that this is a particularly moral way to go about things because it is emboldening the Taiwanese people without sacrificing their autonomy. All right, let's talk about hegemony before I get back half.
Do you believe that, why does democracy matter, honestly?
Yeah, I think democracy is really important for a lot of reasons. I'll talk a little bit more about that when I get to my discussion of hegemony and why you need to have individual democracies, but basically democracy is a good thing because it leads to the expression of voice, it leads to the best type of representation, it leads to economic, political, social, and epistemological justice, which is something that we're always going to defend. No, thank you. All right. When we talk about hegemony and how the U.S. is actually a really good actor in today's debate, we're going to talk about counterbalancing theory. The idea behind having China as a regional hegemon is the idea that they will justly act in their region and the U.S. will justly act in ours. We see, however, through the examples of Tibet and through the treatment of Taiwan and the Uyghurs, that China is not a just actor. This is why, specifically, I tell you that it is just for the U.S. to intervene and for the U.S. to protect democracy and human rights worldwide because the U.S. is a global power now, right? Don't buy any of this improbabilistic miscalc scenario that comes from opening government that's there's going to be one guy on a ship that accidentally presses a button and that causes global war. No, we see empirically that because of the equal military levels of China and the U.S., there's not going to be any type of escalation. The reason that you get to escalation is if the U.S. looks weak by withdrawing and not getting into the quid pro quo stuff that opening government wants to have you believe will happen. Don't buy these improbabilistic scenarios because they're not sustainable, right? All right, let's talk a little bit more about democracy and why we think it's something that is worth protecting. Democracy is inherently a good value. It's something that we as the U.S. value in and of ourselves. If we don't take this action to support democracy abroad, then it makes the U.S. look weak. This is a bad thing because it means that China will be further emboldened to take advantage of the U.S. This will happen within specifically the South China Sea that the opening government wants to tell you about, right? If the U.S. military support goes away, it's perceived as support for China instead. This means that the counterbalancing that they want to talk about doesn't actually happen. David's going to expand a little bit more on the impacts of this, but to point when the United States already looks weak, we cannot embolden China to act as an aggressor in the region, right? It's basically granting a blank check for China to do whatever they want and to continue these types of human rights abuses. If we grant a blank check to China to continue human rights abuses, what are we saying to other authoritarian regimes that the U.S. doesn't have economic ties with, right? We find empirically that no, the U.S. is not the world superpower and is not the world protectorate, and that we should go around protecting democracy everywhere with our guns, but rather it is our support for Taiwan and it is our support for democracies worldwide that secure our legitimate power as a state superpower, as a superpower, and ensures that democracy will be protected around the world.
I'd like to thank the Leader of Opposition for their case and welcome up the Deputy Prime Minister to lead the case for government.
Here.
Lots of assertions, not a whole lot of engagement. This is a ridiculous analysis of why conflict is going to happen, is not responsive to Nathan's analysis about the interests of China and why China is necessarily going to continue escalating in the Taiwanese Strait. We have empirical evidence that we've shown you to counterbalance the, quote, theoretical principle of democracy to show you that why, as long as we remain in the region, it continues to set China off and causes them to do escalatory actions that creates a flashpoint for war. Justifying democracy by saying it is epistemologically true is a 101 philosophy class justification without explaining, number one, why democracy is better than authoritarianism insofar as China has remained one of the most powerful states as a result of clamping down on human rights, and two, why protecting democracy is more important than making sure people don't kill as a result of the United States' reckless policy in the Taiwanese Strait. David, you got a lot of work to do, but I suspect you won't do it, so CO, let's engage. Two things in this debate. First, China's symbolic interest in why they're actually important, Gillian. Second, United States' interest in why democracy isn't enough. First, on China's symbolic interest. Nathan told you, unresponded to, as to why Chinese interests are an extension of power, which is to say that the larger that the United States gets, this is the global hegemon analysis that she gave you that was actually pretty good, is not necessarily as important as soon as Chinese wants to do things like, secure economic interests in trade deals with other people. The reason, closing opposition, why they occupy Tibet is it is a literal part of Chinese territory, and they have historic relations with that individual country. Taiwan is a symbolic state that they extend their power to, which is why the CCP is only willing to make rhetorical gestures about how they're going to invade Taiwan, but never actually send any troops to the border because they know if they do that, the United States is actually going to hit back. That's why the United States, looking weak by pulling out troops, isn't going to cause China to invade Taiwan. Lots of assertive links there. I think you should prevent the analysis as to why they won't, even though mutually assured destruction exists from Nathan. So what does that mean? They say that China is going to feel emboldened to take advantage. The reason that they don't hit back is because they know that, number one, there's still a large enough presence in Taiwan that we're going to keep to where it's going to stall an invasion to the point where eventually United States jets flying in from other military bases are going to have to come in, and they don't have very long. Yeah, they might end up killing some people on the worst case side of your house, but they know they're not willing to take that calculus because they know invading the United States, a huge United States ally, and triggering the nuclear umbrella response by Japan and other states in the region and in the East Asia region will destroy China. They can't win that war. They're not even going to try to because it destroys their Belt and Road Initiative. They have to take all that money and divert it to a war. That's the reason they won't engage in war, is because it's too expensive. They snap back. This is why China's interested in things. They're not the evil actor that opening opposition wants to paint them as. No, thank you. United States interest. Global hegemony is good, China is bad. The only example they give you is the treatment of the Uyghurs, the Uyghur population in the Xinjiang province of China. Several responses. First of all, I think the United States pretends to care about democracy but doesn't actually care about democracy. I think the perfect example is that the entire world knows that we give a shit ton of arms to Saudi Arabia to allow them to bomb the shit out of Yemen and bring back cholera in the region. We tacitly endorse the principles of democracy, which might, I remind you, is less important than saving lives if that's the calculus by which we should weigh this debate. And everyone knows the United States doesn't care, which means that if we do this, it's not going to send a message to authoritarian dictators that they know they can take advantage of other populations if doing so conflicts with the hegemony of the United States and risks escalating war. So even if they try to do this in the future, we'd far prefer save millions of lives in the Taiwanese Strait and the Chinese region by not allowing the escalation of war. We told you about how those warships came 45, not meters, yards close. The response that they gave you was, why would anyone pull the trigger? No one wants to go to war with each other. That's the point. There have been multiple times where the escalation of conflict has almost come to the brink of war. The president of Russia had to send a letter to Kennedy to say, we saw some warships flying over our airspace and we almost shot them down because they didn't have the insignia on the plane. You need to be careful. That's what happens when you send two different military powers too close into contact without any lines of communication. Is someone thinks that the other person isn't going to blink, and then shit happens. Even if this doesn't happen, you should err on the side of caution and avoid the risk of war, because the calculus for supporting principled democracy and avoiding a conflict that kills others is a really easy decision for you to make as a judge, right? Then they say, also, I don't think United States hegemony has been that great in the future. I think hegemony has led to things like invading the Middle Eastern states to try and promote democracy, when really we're just going in there for their oil. It's done things like lead to the growth of states like Iran and China, because they realize that as the bigger the United States gets, the less territory and resources they have to take for themselves, which creates a response mechanism by which their entire foreign policy is based on opposing the United States. The reason we have so many enemies to fight and spend money on is because we're a global hegemon. I don't think China's all that bad. We should probably just let them take hegemony in the region and make sure people don't die as a result of it. Opening.
All right, the problem is that China, perceptually sees Taiwan as theirs, as owning Taiwan, even if they're not in, the region right now. This is unjust. It means that Taiwan will never have the opportunity to democratize and fulfill their own form of state legitimacy.
Two responses. First of all, they're allowed to have their own form of democracy insofar as they literally have a parliament where they elect the leaders of government, where they control the autonomy of resources, where they tax their citizens and spend the money how they want. Yes, China, quote, claims it as theirs because that's the symbolic principled extension. See the first piece of analysis that I gave you, opening opposition. They're never going to actually do anything about it because it's about sending propaganda to the people of China to make sure they can extend their state authority. They won't do anything about it because, as I told you, the United States has nukes. So, given that, what haven't I responded to? Okay, so I already did the stuff about democracy. They have to tell me why it's actually important and why the United States needs to care about it. Let's talk about North Korea for a hot minute. I think that the reason that the North Korean conflict has failed to be solved for the last 60 years since the Korean War is because all the reasons I gave you in my first point about China's symbolic interest. The same reason they are, quote, in Taiwan, they're not really in Taiwan, is the same reason they don't want United States troops on the Korean Peninsula, which is because it threatens their border, right? Remember, during the Korean War, we went into the north and actually occupied their territory. This is what their entire foreign policy against the United States is based on. Here's what happens when we offer them a strategic concession. First of all, they no longer have to assume that the United States is acting in good faith. We have a tangible strategic concession that we're offering to them and saying, look, things are getting real messy out there in the South China Sea and the Taiwanese Strait. We're going to pull our troops back and give you the opportunity to juxtaposition yourself into a way that we can actually come to peace. When we use it as a bargaining chip at the table to say, look, you do this, you don't have to be afraid of us in the Korean Peninsula anymore, it's far more likely that, number one, China and the United States can actually come to the table and negotiate. Recognize there is precedent for this in literally the last month because they're coming to a negotiation about the trade deal that's actually going to prove out kind of wrong. I was wrong about the trade deal stuff. I got to apologize to Donald Trump now. It sucks. What's also going to happen now is they can use those same mechanisms for negotiation to talk about North Korea. Even if we don't solve all conflicts in the Southeast Asian region or the East Asian region, we still get a way to create open lines of communication to where the point of contact is not absolute hostility, but at least tangible negotiations that it can at least perceivably happen. That is out of order. Better system of negotiations and situation to be in on our side of the house, insofar as it is far better than the status quo. The worst case example they have is that China invades the Taiwan Strait. We told you why that's not going to happen. A lot of work to do.
I got it. Sorry, it's frozen. All right, I'd like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister for this speech and welcome the Deputy Leader of Opposition to close out the opposition, the top half of opposition. Here.
Our worst case scenario is not Chinese ships being in the strait, because that worst case scenario already exists. Let's get into some points of rebuttal. We're going to take out the first 4 minutes of Robert's speech with one double bind. They say that they're never going to be able to engage in war because it's going to have to divert money from the Asian Investment and Infrastructure Bank, but then simultaneously tells us that escalation into a war is going to occur, and because it's almost come out of the brink with this 45 yards of disaster. You can't have no diversion of resources to not have a war and have the escalation leading to war at the same time. You have to pick one. I'm going to pick the one that disadvantages you because I'm on the opposition side. Okay. Okay, let's get into the little bit of responses on the symbolic nature of China. What Robert tells us is that it's never actually going to be intervention into Taiwan. Only what China only cares about is an extension of power. It is an extension of China, and it is the perspective of China that Taiwan is within China. They're never going to have this form of democracy, and all that Taiwan is for China is a form of propaganda. 3 responses. First, propaganda still has the propensity to lead to increased action. That's the necessity and the nature of propaganda. Second, it's still a bad thing, even if you don't buy the democracy thing, that there is a violation of sovereignty. This goes cold conceded by opening government because sovereignty is still important insofar as it is an authoritarian regime or a democratic regime. This is why we ought to defend the state of Taiwan, because the symbolic presence of China will lead to an escalating nature. Finally, they say that they're never going to send troops to the border. But again, what we tell you, or rather what opening government tells you, is that the Chinese warships are going to be coming within 45 yards of the American warships. And what we tell you is that it's better to have a ship 45 yards away from one of the United States ships than a ship on the beach of Taiwan. That is what happens when the US does not have a carved out presence within the strait. It leads to an emboldened nature of China, an increase in escalation, and an inevitable invasion. We're going to bring you 1 point of positive matter, but before that, actually 1 more point of rebuttal on North Korea. They say that from like 40 years ago that China said that they either want the U.S. to make a concession on Taiwan or on Korea. What we're going to tell you is that we ought not make concessions on either, because once you make a concession, China becomes more emboldened to look for further concessions from the United States. This looks like things such as when the U.S. removes itself from the Chinese Strait, an increase in island building within the South China Sea, an increase in encroachment on the base in Okinawa, an inevitable escape from Okinawa, so that not only can they control Taiwan, but they can also control the Korean Peninsula. When you embolden the symbolic action and symbolic nature of China, they are always going to increase their propaganda, they are always going to increase escalation, and they're always going to want to hurt U.S. hegemony. But before I get you, I'll actually take a POI from you.
Cool. So this double bind is a misunderstanding of a procedural argument. They don't divert resources to intentionally send troops to provoke the U.S. in the Taiwan Strait, but accidentally sparking a conflict means they can't back down and have to go to war. That's why your side is having a difficult time with this debate.
Okay, so they're still emboldened to act in war, and they're still emboldened to not, or they're not emboldened to divert resources because they do not want to escalate war. The 3 minutes of analysis that comes out of opening government specifically talking about mutual dependence between China and the United States. It's talking about Chinese hegemony, not wanting to cause an international ruckus. Specifically what they tell you is that they want to protect their international image, and this is not going to lead to an invasion of Taiwan necessarily. We tell you that this is actually going to embolden China because they want an international image that is predicated on their hegemony, not predicated on morality. No, you're not going to take them over your eyes from a quitting government. Okay, 2 points of positive matter. First, retaining current levels of military support increases the autonomy and propensity to action from Taiwan. This responds to the symbolic nature argument that we get from opening government. The 2 trajectory analysis that Gillian gives you, talking about China and Taiwan, is very critical in today's debate. China has been increasing its military technology and increasing the cost of, and increasing the propensity to act within the strait. This is the 45 yards analysis that we get from opening government. The trajectory analysis on Taiwan is as follows. They've been decreasing their capacity for security, and they've also been decreasing their overall military force. This leads into an increased escalation for China, specifically when the U.S. withdraws support because of the trajectory. If Taiwan has decreasing ability to enforce its form of sovereignty, and that China has an increasing incentive to take away those forms of sovereignty, then you see that the U.S. is the only actor that is inevitably going to be able to build a wall between the China side of the strait and the Taiwanese side of the strait. Only wall I'm willing to build from the United States perspective. That's a hardline stance. Closing government.
Would you then have, anytime a country is unable to build a military, have the United States go there and be their military for them?
Okay, 2 things. First, we're telling you that when the United States gives military support, not military troops, it is going to embolden the Chinese actors because it increases the nature of the voluntary military force. A study that was conducted by Reuters a couple weeks ago said that with increased presence from the United States, people within Taiwan responded that they would have an increased likelihood of participating within voluntary military force. That's because there's a hegemon that is now on their side. It is not a deck that is slanted against them. On to the second point of positive matter. Emboldening China to carve out more protection that the United States has in the region. This was a little bit flagged in rebuttal, but I'm going to explain it a little bit better, then give you a little bit of weighing. When the US decreases its ability to enforce its form of hegemony in the region, China becomes more emboldened, based on the analysis of the Chinese hegemony that we get from opening government, to act within the region. When we combine this with Gillian's analysis, specifically talking about dual deterrence theory, when the United States decreases its military support, it increases the perceived support for China. China now becomes more emboldened to act because they see that this is not a form of two-way control that the United States is having in the region. It's a form of one-way control because the United States always has a vested interest in China insofar as they have like half of our security bonds. Next, it's going to increase mutual fear from both parties and decrease trust. This looks like engagement between Taiwan and China only happening through military means rather than what's happening right now in the trajectory that's existing of an increased engagement and reassuring of China, you're out of order, and the nature of removing obstacles. Let's talk about a little bit of comparative. On their side of the house, what we get is a world in which we have no war, we have no escalation, and we have a North Korea that is going to be emboldened. What we tell you is that we ought to protect the autonomy of all actors in the region, regardless of whether or not it means we have to prop up their militaries, because we believe that military intervention on behalf of the United States is the only way to deter action from Taiwan, deter action from China, increase the sovereignty of Taiwanese autonomy, and overall not embolden China to act and decrease the hegemony of the United States. For the aforementioned reasons, vote opening opposition.
I would like to thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for their speech and welcome up the Member of Government to open up the back half of today's debate. Hear, hear.
Hear, hear.
Okay. A few things to be honest about. I am a rookie in this matter, and so I'm pretty sure that I have not read a book on debate, but this is probably a mistake. I'm just going to flat out say it. I am not an expert on foreign policy, okay? What I can tell you from experience is that I am an expert on the value of life. And it's not something that we're really discussing. I'm hearing things like hegemony and proximity and human rights. And so with that said, I'm going to take the opportunity to dig into a few points first, and then I'll go into some refutation. Number one, actively having a military presence worsens tensions with China. From an economic standpoint, its impact, particularly on small businesses in America, is deafening, right? They continually have to buy materials at a cheaper cost from China, but when we have these increased tensions with China, that is null and void. These materials are no longer valid, they are no longer affordable because of things like tariffs, right? Particularly, two, I'll get into, is our military is already spread thin. As a combat veteran in the era of America's longest war, I am tired of having to fix other people's shit, right? The idea or our concept are like, yeah, let's support the military, let's support all other countries, and like, let's be realistic. America's got plenty of shit we need to work on ourselves, right? Additionally, we are not the world's police, right? I'll be honest, we've all at some point had a neighbor who has a badass kid. They're just bad. They're just horrible. They're horrible, horrible people, right? It's not our job, as long as they are not doing harm to our children, to interfere and parent other people's children. That's not what we're doing. And when we keep adding military support for other countries to solve their problems, that's not our responsibility. Not right now. Additionally, right? We've all had that annoying hall monitor in our lives, right? Imagine how ridiculous it would be if that hall monitor loud and proud, had their little sash on, and they decided they want to cross jurisdiction into another high school and tell those high school kids what to do. It's outrageous, right? But no, like, we need to protect these things, right? Going into a little refutation, again, I said it earlier, we talk a lot about human rights, right? But how can we interrupt human rights violations when we violate human rights violations ourselves, right? Let's be realistic. Guantanamo Bay, right? Yeah, people love to quote the Constitution, and we have all these things to protect our citizens, but let's be realistic. We do not treat people equally in our own country. That includes Muslims, that includes people of color, that includes our LGBT people, that includes a lot more than that, and I don't have time to go into every single one. I'm going to take a little riff from the Deputy Prime Minister here, right? He said the U.S. does not give a shit about democracy. Not right now. The U.S. does not give a shit about human rights either, right? And that is problematic when you're trying to justify why we're consistently going overseas and defending all these people's rights when we can't even fix our own shit, right? Instead, we're just piling ourselves up in somebody else's shit till we can't fucking breathe. Going back to the value of life, right? Why are we putting our troops in harm's way for somebody else? We're spread thin. We're still fighting the longest war, right? We want us to do border security. We want us to fight all these conflicts, solve all these world's problems, and it's problematic as fuck, and we're putting our own lives at risk. Our own men, women, and children, and families. Trauma is real. And to be honest, a lot of these times we go to these conflicts, and those people don't give a shit that we're there. We're promoting democracy, and sometimes people just want their fucking lives back. Let's not consistently get involved. Yes.
Okay, so continuing, you're making a lot of cool analogies about like kids and stuff. Imagine that one kid pushes another kid into a pool, thereby taking away their rights, basically the right to life. Is it not then your moral responsibility to save that kid from drowning in the pool?
Saving a kid and like completely going to another country and correcting somebody else's behavior is not the same thing. I'm not going to say that I'm going to let that kid drown. Like, no. Maybe I'll throw him a lifesaver or something or hop in there. It depends how deep the water is. Like, I'll be honest with you, I'm an Army veteran, not a combat veteran. I'm an Army veteran, not a Navy veteran, right? So we're not known for swimming. So that's not my skill set. But thank you for your question. Again, I really want to strive. Like, we're not the world's police. We're not super secret deputized hall monitors. We are our own country with our own issues, with our own problems. And with that, as a combat veteran in the era of America's longest war, I am proud to support this motion. Thank you.
I would like to thank the member of government for their speech and welcome up the member of opposition to begin the case for DWGB. Here, here.
Aidan, can I have your phone?
Oh yeah. He lost his phone, so he needs timer for mine.
Lost is a strong word.
Left at the Airbnb is a more accurate description.
You know where it is.
I know, yeah, I know exactly what that
Oh
is.
yes.
I got my charger though.
I thought we were only supposed to small talk after the round.
We're friendly here.
This house would like to welcome the member of opposition.
The problem with the entire round as it has proceeded so far is that Taiwan, China, and the US are not the only nations in Asia. They're not the only nations in the South China Sea, and they're not the only actors in this debate. A lot of my extension will be analyzing how the US pulling and their support for Taiwan will affect the region as a whole, how the US allies will act, why that will further destabilize the region. Because a lot of the rebuttal to everything you've heard on GovBench is predicated on that extension, I'm going to go Canadian on you and do extension first, rebuttal second. Okay, first. We think that what does this look like, right? Because it's disingenuous to say that taking away U.S. support means like taking away troops, and let's say moving the 7th Fleet, right? We think that for this to be justifiable, you need to actually move like U.S. ships out of the South China Sea. I'm not saying that OG's model wasn't this, right? Like I'm not just saying that. I'm just saying like clarifying that this is what happens, right? Which means that it's not just that like Taiwan loses the presence of the 7th Fleet. It's that Japan loses the presence of the 7th Fleet. It's that Korea loses the presence of the 7th Fleet. Because the South China Sea is fairly small, right? And like a U.S. carrier strike force can move between all those countries and acts as a deterrent between all those countries, right? So when the U.S. moves and decreases vastly their like fleet in the South China Sea, that affects all the countries in the South China Sea. When the U.S. removes their nuclear umbrella from Taiwan, that affects more countries than just Taiwan. No, thank you. Okay. What are the problems with this? First, and most importantly, it gives the impression that the U.S. is abandoning its allies. This has principal harms insofar as the U.S. has obligation through international norms to protect allies that they've agreed to protect. That's going to be a theme throughout my speech. Yeah, I'll take it over.
This is a super unfair characterization of what we have to do. Either we remove all of the troops and the warships from the base on the southern part of Taiwan, or we make sure that ships in Korea and Japan who are way far away from Taiwan don't come to the defense of Taiwan. Korea can keep its troops. That is a ridiculous characterization of how this debate should operate.
Okay, no, because China's not going to believe that if the 7th Fleet is sitting in strike range of a Chinese fleet, that the U.S. promises like, hey, we're not going to protect Taiwan, is viable, right? Like, we think that's absolutely absurd. If there's a U.S. carrier strike force with an assault ship with 80 planes on it, and a U.S. super carrier with 100 planes on it, sitting in range of China, that is presence, that is protecting Taiwan. That's what you have to get rid of, to justifiably remove alliances from Taiwan. Secondly, and this is actually a main point, is even if you buy Robert's analysis that China won't go into Taiwan, it's unlikely that Taiwan will buy Robert's analysis. It's unlikely that Japan will buy Robert's analysis, right? It's unlikely that the U.S. can go to the world and say, hey, I know it looks like we're abandoning our allies, but actually there's some strategic considerations, and we don't think China will go in anyways. What we think the rest of the world will look like is that the U.S. are moving military troops away from an ally, that the U.S. are moving nuclear protection away from an ally, that the U.S. are moving their 7th Fleet outside of the South China Sea. That is what China will see. That is what the actors in the round will see, or the actors in the South China Sea will see. No, thank you. Okay. So not only does this have principal harms insofar as the U.S. looks bad, they look callous, and they look weak for abandoning an ally that they have agreed to protect, but secondly, it has huge ramifications for the actors in the region. I'm going to go through 3: Japan, Korea, and ASEAN. No, thank you. Japan, and this is the most important one, right? Because throughout the round, there's been the characterization that the U.S. is the only power in the region. Yet the world's third largest economy sits within range of China. Not to mention a third largest economy that has a century-and-a-half long and deeply bloody feud with China. We think also the characterization of Japan under Shinzo Abe is one that is more right-wing and one that is more militaristic than Japan has been since 1945. That means that when the U.S. pulls support for Japan, or for Taiwan, and the U.S. move forces out of the South China Sea, it's very easy for that right-wing Japanese government to go to the people and say, look, the U.S. is abandoning their allies, the U.S. is decreasing their presence, it's up to us to protect ourselves. It's up to us to increase militarization. This is incredibly harmful because we've seen, even with the introduction of Soryu-class stealth submarines that Japan introduced, which they had in small numbers, China threw an international fit just to the fact that Japan had high-tech stealth submarines. We think when Japan starts massively remilitarizing, you're going to cause huge instability and a likely arms race between the second and third largest economies in the world that happen to hate each other more than almost any two countries in the world. No, thank you. Okay, secondly, ASEAN, right? No, thank you. Okay, because ASEAN, the league which includes a variety of South Asian nations, has openly requested U.S. presence and has consistently openly supported U.S. presence in the South China Sea. This is because they have no ability to deal with China themselves. The problem is when the U.S. removes that choice, under the status quo, they have a choice to either deal with China or deal with the U.S., and they can choose the U.S. because they feel that the U.S. will back them. When there's not a U.S. presence in the region, and when there's a perception that the U.S. abandons their allies, no thank you, they're likely to choose China. The U.S. loses a valuable trading partner. Those ASEAN countries are likely worse under Chinese hegemony than they are under American hegemony. Last point, Korea, because we think Korea thinks much the same thing as Japan, especially given that North Korea sits there, especially given that the U.S. military support in the South China Sea that Korea relies on heavily as deterrence is no longer there. Korea also remilitarizes farther. No, thank you. And here's where I get into rebuttal, right? Okay, so from OG, we get the idea that I already said, so they get the idea that Taiwan, that you can de-escalate because it removes the power in the region. The problem is the U.S. aren't the only power in the region. As I talked about, a remilitarized Japan causes even more instability. No, thank you. Okay, next. China will de-escalate if we do, right? One, we think that it's unlikely that China will de-escalate because they have no real incentive to. But secondly, we think that you actually get increased escalation for all the reasons I talked about. You actually get increased escalation because even if the U.S. moves forces out, we think it's likely that those forces will be replaced by Korean and Chinese forces. No, thank you. We think it's likely that China will see these partners as problematic. Insofar as right now there's a static equilibrium between China and the U.S. Now there becomes a non-static one between Japan and China where they're engaged in an arms race. Last thing, you get concessions in Korea. Again, unlikely because China has no incentive to give away Korea, especially when we're preemptively giving them concessions with Taiwan, right? There's no reason for them to give us Korea back. But secondly, you actually get worse because now Korea feels like they don't have an ally in the region. So even if you get concessions for North Korea, you just have South Korea remilitarizing farther. Okay, onto the extension really quickly because we get two ideas: that the American military is stretched thin and that they're not the world's police. Few things on the world's police thing. But they are a superpower and they have obligations as a superpower to promote stability. Insofar as I can prove to you that this action will increase instability in the South China Sea, the U.S. has an obligation not to do that. But secondly, if we want to go with the kids analogy, you've already made an obligation, right? If you agree to babysit that shitty kid and then you just leave, that's problematic. And that's what you're doing here. But lastly, the idea that the U.S. military is stretched thin, right? I understand that the U.S. is engaged in bad wars, but I think we can bring the boys in Iraq home and keep the boys in the South China Sea there, seeing as they're serving a vastly important purpose in keeping the region stable. Ladies and gentlemen, the U.S. presence in the South China Sea is the only thing stopping an arms race between Japan, Korea, and China prior to the
I'd like to thank the member of opposition for their speech and welcome up to the government whip. Close at the government bench. You're here.
Okey-dokey. What Eric and I want to do when we get up here is tell you that this is not just a conversation for scholars to have in a room to break down hegemony, theories and stuff, because we get that, we understand it's valuable, but the reality is that what really matters is the impact it has on the individual level. What does it actually mean when we have a military presence in a foreign country? What does it mean when we have soldiers and are building up our military, specifically asking people like Eric, people who are uniquely targeted to join the military because we haven't blown up military? What does that mean locally? When Eric comes up here and tells you, which by the way, we didn't really get a lot of refutation on this point, and it's a really big point, so we feel like it flows through, right? Eric comes up here and tells you that not only do we have a military relationship with China, we have an economic relationship, right? And this economic relationship is huge. As China's economy is growing and growing, we see that they are a necessary partner. When Eric comes up here and tells you that small businesses suffer from higher tariffs that happen, because that is the retaliation that we get from China, right? When we have these heightened tensions, we see an economic reaction as well. Small businesses aren't able to deal with those impacts, right? Small businesses are not able to cut in to make up the higher cost of of items like clothes or whatever things we buy from China. And so we believe that for you as citizens at the individual level, this uniquely has a negative impact. And so we believe that not only are we talking about these foreign policies and things, we're talking about the problem it has for everyday citizens that already are struggling. He comes up here and tells you about the value of life, right? He talks to you about what does it mean to ask soldiers to essentially sacrifice their lives and not even just physically sacrifice their lives in the sense that they potentially could die, but also sacrifice their time and being abroad. What does it mean to do this for so-called democracy, right? Because that's all we get from the opposition is this idea from this top half, right? Is we get that we need to perpetuate democracy and human rights, and we get all these notions that the United States is this moral is supposed to be the moral police, and even from the bottom half we get this conversation about how we are obligated as a superpower. But again, what does it mean when your police officer is a corrupt police officer? What does it mean when you have a corrupt police officer, corrupt superpower going over to other nations and saying you are doing bad things, you're breaking democracy and human rights, when within our own borders we essentially have detention camps for immigrants, right? Within our own borders we are having these huge problematic issues with human rights. What does it mean when we are the power that is going abroad and saying you are doing bad? And what does it mean when we still continue to have a relationship with countries like Saudi Arabia, right? And we don't say anything there. Like, we, if anything, harm our own ability to prove ourselves as a democratic nation when we support false democracies abroad and when we like support false values. So when we actually, before I move on, yeah, I'll take top half.
Okay, great. We're the ones that tell you that the U.S. in the region emboldens China, meaning that the lives of the individuals on the ground in Taiwan are substantially worsened. Please tell me why the lives of individuals in the U.S. are worth so much more than the lives of individuals in Taiwan.
So 2 points. First of all, you guys, I believe it's you guys. No, actually, yeah, it's you guys who bring up this whole like Taiwan autonomy thing. We think it's great. Taiwanese, like, people should have autonomy. When the United States has a strong presence there, though, we don't actually allow for that, right? And this actually feeds into this point that bottom half has about like the region and how like there are more countries in the Southeast Asia. We believe those nations should be the nations who are banding together and doing something. Like, let's empower those nations to like band together, because they are the ones who actually know what they need to do to make sure China doesn't like tramp on or stomp on their ground, right? Like, who are we as like a nation that's all the way over here on this other side of the world who has their own agenda? Like, who are we to get involved with these other countries who honestly, like, they know what they need, and we should allow, if anything, our presence hurts their ability to like come together as like a region and stand up against China, because we are consistently saying, you guys don't know how to do this, you guys can't do this, we need to be here and be your superhero. You know what? Taiwanese people don't need a superhero. If we give them the ability to like promote their own military, give them the ability to build a relationship with these other nations by taking a step back, we would actually see that the region will become more peaceful. So let's actually see what this debate came down to. Essentially, we have a question of peace, right? So in what world, what side gives you a more peaceful world? On the government side, not only do we tell you that when we de-escalate, other nations will de-escalate as well. Like, we can even see this in the Middle East, right? Like, we look at Syria, Yemen, where like as we increase our presence and increase like the arms that we throw in, other nations will like equally respond to that. Same thing when we like decrease the amount of soldiers that we're putting in, we decrease the amount of arms that go in, other nations also respond equally. So we like totally buy into this conversation, and we believe that this happens. Like, nations don't want to go to war. We believe that it is like completely it's American centered to believe that China is going to have this like irrational response to these actions. And then on our side too, we say that we give you a peaceful world for our own citizens, right? We allow soldiers to come home. We allow soldiers to have a life. We allow people in our own borders to like have economic progress and have like a safer nation. We allow for a secure world, not only for our own citizens, but for the like citizens of other places. And then the other point that we get down to is who values life better, right? Like, because over here on the side of the opposition, they tell you that, hey, we need to like human rights and like democracy, and that this is what people think. On the government side, we're telling you people don't like, they don't care what's going on. They care about security. They want to be able to like feel safe and like eat food and like do whatever. And so how do people feel safe? It's when they don't see military ships just like flying by, when they don't see troops standing like next to them. You know, having this military presence has a very real influence on people's like even just understanding of like what's going on. Even if like Taiwan is safe, but if they see like in a moment, you know, but they see a troop walking by, then suddenly like, is there something for me to be scared of? Like, what does it mean to have troops in a country and like and traumatize them essentially by making them feel like they're in war or they're like fighting? So we believe that on the side of the government, we actually provide a safer world for you. So when you are voting, it comes down to these two issues, right? Which side of the bench gives you a more safer world and gives you a more peaceful world, and which side values life better, right? We are telling you that not only does the government side do that, but Eric and I specifically tell you why to care about these issues at the individual level, like why you should step away from some of these like privileged conversations essentially, because like, cool, we get to have these conversations, but like individuals don't get to have that conversation. Individuals, you know, like are the ones that are actually affected, and we're telling you why those people matter, the impact that this motion has on those people. And for those reasons alone, you should prefer not only the government side, but prefer the bottom bench of the government side. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the government whip for their speech and welcome up the opposition whip, close out the opposition bench and the big hall. Here.
Oh, shit, I forgot my phone.
Just like your partner.
Oh, yeah.
It just started.
Okay, I think that clearly
government side has won this debate just based on the fact that we actually consider all the actors in this region. First, I'm going to go into like some case-by-case refutation and sort of pull at the broad themes of what. Sorry, I meant to say opposition. Whatever. Freudian slip. And we say that like government side loses this just based on impacts alone. And then after I'll go into Rhys's extension by saying we've clearly looked at not just the impacts of like the U.S., China, and Taiwan, but the societal impacts, the impacts of the Asia-Pacific region, and then the impacts for the entire world and the rules-based international order. So first, I sort of want to characterize what OG's case is about. So it was all right. The theme of their case was the fact that they look at the Asian-Pacific sphere and the rules-based international order very superficially. They do not consider the deeper region-wide conflicts of region-wide consequences of removing military support. Not to mention the principled argument that the U.S. should protect sworn U.S. allies and the implication we get from this. As I will go in, we think that on the opposition side of the House, you get far greater impacts that makes OG clearly fall out of the round. So let's go into what they said. So the crux of their case leveraged on this idea that currently the military support in Taiwan creates a potential flashpoint which is likely to cause a war. We say that actually on their side of the House, with a likely invasion of Taiwan as Rhys analyzed for you when you pull out of the region, that you don't just get a chance of war, but you get like almost certain war. And then an ensuing arms race between the two economic superpowers, Japan and China, who are sworn enemies. Like, all of this instability eventually comes back to the U.S. because when the missiles are flying, the U.S. can't just sit this one out. But I will take back half.
What proof do you have that this will happen?
Okay, what the Rhys has just literally gone in his entire extension about how China has consistently demonstrated war drills, how China has rhetoric of literally one China, like considers Taiwan its own country and blocks it from international representation. This is pretty clear established on our side of the House. Also, they characterize China as an economic rival and not military. We think that we clearly debunk this with because this is a fundamental mischaracterization of China's ambitions, as China's had the second largest military in the world, and their military budget has increased 10 times since 2002. Imagine your military budget doubling every few years. So we think that OG falls out of the round, as they blanketly do not consider the impacts of the region or greater society. What about CG? Not at this time. We don't think that CG is also very impactful because they kind of are just derivative of OG's case. Taking CG at their best case, however, they say that the U.S. shouldn't be the world's police and that it's not our responsibility to defend others. We have two responses to this. As we pointed out, you can't look at this situation as merely involving just the U.S., Taiwan, and China. And you have to assume that if the U.S. pulls out, and you can't assume that if the U.S. pulls out, it's just suddenly only a China and Taiwan problem. We see that this is a region-wide conflict and a region-wide issue of stability with multiple different regional actors who are sworn U.S. allies. When you remove the U.S., the entire region stabilizes. Problems with other parts of the world are inherently our problem because as we have established, this is an interconnected, globalized world. When there's war in the Pacific, it doesn't just cause a global humanitarian crisis, and it destroys and it hurts U.S. allies, but it also destroys U.S. trade with our two largest trading powers. We say that it's hard to trade in a region and maximize our own economic benefits when there's war between two global powers. So again, the theme of OG's case here is we shouldn't be the world's police, we shouldn't be involved in foreign wars, and they don't want us here. We've addressed this by saying, no, when you let global instability rampant, it hurts us, it affects the US, and also these people want us there, like Taiwan, Korea, Japan, asks and wants the US 7th Fleet in here. They also talked about this idea of a corrupt police officer. We say when you replace US hegemony in the region, you get Chinese hegemony. Sorry, this is a realist IOR round. China has a long history of being way shittier to its allies and its own people. Forget the genocides, forget the invasions, forget the Uyghur concentration camp. The US has allies, China has vassals. Getting on to no, not at this time, I've already gotten a POI. Rhys's extension. Okay, so Rhys brought to you, what are the region-wide effects? Rhys brought to you the region-wide effects of significant reduced military support. In his extension, Rhys brought you the most impactful point in the round, how significantly reducing military support not only furthers an aggressive China and is likely to lead to an invasion of Taiwan, as China has postured for the last 50 years, but how it also destabilizes the entire region, how other of our allies interpret this as a signal of the U.S. pulling out support of its allies and not defending the region as a whole. And this leads to weakening relationships between historic U.S. allies. On this, Rhys provided you with a detailed actor analysis of Japan specifically, explaining how this is the worst possible time as to significantly reduce the U.S. military presence in the Pacific, as Japan is at its most militaristic since World War II. He told you that the impact of this motion was likely to lead to an arms race between the world's second and third largest economy. Not at this time. We also talked to you about Korea and how Korea's long history of being not only invaded by North Korea, but China only stokes fear in them. He told you that, he also, linking this stability impact to stability like abroad, he told you that stability abroad is stability at home. This has been the crux of the rules-based international order. As soon as you let stability break down, not at this time, come on guys. As soon as you let stability break down in regions, it comes back to U.S. shores. The last two wars that have been fought between global powers have drawn in the entire world into their conflict, especially other global powers who might be far away like the United States. Remember World War II and the First World War. If there's a war or even an arms race between China and Japan, you better believe the U.S. will be drawn in, hence the Korean War. Rhys also brought you the principle of defending allies is not only a principled good, but it is the crux of this rules-based international order. The rules-based international order has brought prosperity for the U.S. and other allies since World War II. This has been very clear. Global inequality has dropped, poverty, etc., etc. This has been good. When you pass this motion, you destabilize this, you break down the world-based international order. When you stop protecting allies and allow for regions to further destabilize, this destroys this rules-based international orders because it sets a precedent that countries that solving conflicts is just based on a realist IR who has the bigger guns method. CO wins this debate clearly because we brought you the greatest impacts that actually consider the implications for not just China, the U.S. Taiwan, but the impacts for the entire Asia-Pacific region, our sworn U.S. allies, and the rules-based international orders. Thank you. We're proud to oppose.
I would like to take an opportunity to